big call. I'm very happy that today we have a special guest. It's not often we have a guest on this little call. So I'm quite excited to be chatting with Andy Blow from Precision Hydration. Now, most of you guys know Precision Hydration as a company. We've been strong advocates for their products and been championing their use for the last couple of years. And Andy comes from a similar background from me. He was a former athlete, and he's now running what I consider to be one of the best sports nutrition and hydration companies in the world. And I wanted to get him on, and he was kind enough to give up some time to come and chat with us. Now, he's in a van, in a field at 6 a.m. on a camping trip in the UK. So we're going to keep this as succinct and short as possible so that he can get back to his family holiday. But Andy, I appreciate you being here, mate. Thanks for joining.
No, it's all good, Ben. I'm an early riser anyway, and the kids are still snoring away in the tent just over there, so it's not a problem. I've got my coffee on. It's all good.
Yeah, I was very happy to see you had a coffee. I'd certainly need some sort of stimulant at that time of the morning, man.
I was just going to say, you know what it's like. Years of swimming and getting up at 5 a.m. for that. This is 6 a.m.'s a lion.
Exactly. I don't miss the swimming though so much.
No.
No. Anyway, mate, I thought to kickstart this, because most of our guys are familiar with the company, Precision Hydration, but I think not many of them will know you or your background. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about your background and why you started Precision Hydration in the first place.
Yeah, sure. Well, like you said, Ben, like you, I was an athlete for many years, mainly focused on doing triathlon, racing at sort of what I would call would be the equivalent these days of like a very good age group level or a slightly bad pro level. I was sneaking in the top 10 of a few Ironman races and that sort of thing. Training sort of full time. I had to work alongside my training quite a bit in order to actually support it, but my attitude was very much full time and going after sport really, really hard for a number of years. And it was I'd prior to that, I'd studied sport and exercise science, and it was kind of a combination of the study and then doing triathlon and trying to achieve a high level that got me interested in nutrition and hydration, especially because it was the part of my racing that tended to go badly all of the time. I trained pretty hard. I was pretty lucky when I was younger, certainly, and was relatively resistant to injuries. So I got quite fit, but I showed up to my first Ironman race in 2000 in Switzerland, thinking that I was going to do really, really well, and you know, all outward signs in terms of the shape I was in suggested that I could go really well, and I ended up absolutely blowing apart. And then that happened a number of times in a number of long distance races, usually in the heat, and to the point where a couple of times I was in the medical tent. I was really, really quite ill, and there were lots of clues at the time that it was to do with fluid balance and hydration. It actually boiled down to the fact in the end that in a lot of those early races I was over drinking, and I saw that one of the questions that someone had put in today was about over drinking, so we can kind of dive into that a bit more in due course. But I had basically probably 5 years of battles with getting my hydration right for long course triathlon racing in the heat. And it was through what I learned in that process. And I worked with a friend of mine who was a doctor called Dr. Raj Jutli, who's quite an eminent heart surgeon. And he was the first person to really kind of set me off down the right path of looking at sodium loss, looking at my hydration status as an individual. He'd noticed very sort of astutely that in some of these races where I was doing badly, he'd seen me after the finish line. I've seen photos of my kit covered in salt. He'd looked at the symptoms that I was getting and some of the sort of signs that he could see, and suggested to me that what it looked like was happening was there was something horribly wrong with my hydration and fluid balance, and what I'd mistook to be dehydration might have been a condition called hypernatremia, which is where you dilute your blood sodium levels. So I then started to, obviously, as an athlete who was trying to really push my own limits, I got really, really interested in reading into all of this, doing some research, doing some testing, doing some practical trial and error in my races. And the good part of the story was that by the end of my racing career, I felt like I was able to go and pull my weight and, you know, compete well in hot and humid environments. They were never my favorite sort of environments, but I don't think they are for a lot of people. But once I figured out the recipe of what I was doing wrong with fluids and electrolytes, it was a complete game changer for me. And at that point, I was transitioning out of being an athlete and into working as a sports scientist. I was working, I set up a sports science lab, I guess a little bit like, you know, Ben's set up really in coached, although we were predominantly at that time focused on working with motor racing drivers and athletes, and started to then apply some of what I'd learned in hydration for triathlon to other athletes that we were working with, and specifically the sweat test, which is what Ben, you know, offers in Singapore, taking a sweat sample and looking at electrolyte composition to help individualize. And that then just gradually over a period of 3 or 4 years, circumstances conspired that it seemed like a good idea to turn that into a standalone business. And we did that in 2011. We incorporated precision hydration, primarily at that point to do sweat testing with athletes. And our first sort of proper contract of work there was with the England rugby team to do some work with them prior to, I think it was prior to Six Nations or World Cup that was coming up. And from there on, it kind of evolved and developed, and it has been for the last 8 or 9 years. So where we're at now is we're still predominantly a UK based company. We have 10 people in the business now. We have one of those guys is in Vancouver in Canada. The rest of us are in the UK on the south coast in a little place called Christchurch. And through a fantastic network of people like Ben around the world, we have a number of sweat testing centres and people who are able to offer the sweat testing service and some of our products and advice to athletes, you know, in different environments. And for very obvious reasons, where you guys all are in Singapore with the heat and humidity, dehydration is always a big topic. And what Ben's done a fantastic job over the last few years of you know, bringing this information to people. So when he invited me to come on and chat with everyone today, I was really pleased to do it, and I'm looking forward to, you know, answering some of these questions and having a conversation with everyone.
Awesome, man. So we've got a whole bunch of questions that have come in, as you've seen. And if anyone on the call now, I think we've got 22 people on the call. If any of you have questions, you can just whack them into the chat. And so long as time permits, we'll get to those during the call as well. I'm mindful of Andy's time because he does have a young family and they are on holiday. So I don't want to keep him all day long on this. We'll try and cap it to about an hour at most. And the first thing though I wanted to ask you, Andy, because I think even like, you know, where we are, we're in such a hot and humid, miserable place. And we spend so much of our time encouraging people to hydrate properly and to take in what they need. But it's really quite interesting, not just with our guys that we coach and work with, but just seeing people at races and training clinics and things that we offer. It's a lot of people have somewhat of a resistance to doing the work and figuring out what they need. And I was just curious to know from your point of view, if maybe you can highlight why hydration is so important when it comes to sports performance.
I think it's the principal reason. If you boil down all of the physiology of it into the most simplistic thing, the problem you get with dehydration in sport is principally reduced blood volume. So when we're exercising, we rely on good blood flow going to the working muscles, going to the skin to cool us down. And also the irony is that blood is where sweat comes from, because sweat is drawn from your blood plasma. So the way it works when you start to exercise and get hot is that your hypothalamus in your brain tells your body that or sends neurotransmitters down to the sites where at the skin where you've got sweat glands, tells them to produce sweat, which then is drawn from your capillary bed. It's the plasma part of your blood effectively. Some of that is drawn, or the watery bit of that, plus a few electrolytes are drawn out onto the skin to evaporate away and take heat away. So at the same time that your body is crying out for maximum blood volume and maximum blood flow, you're actually sort of depleting that pool. And although the body can to a certain extent cope with a bit of dehydration because it's got a reasonable volume of blood, and because it can also transfer fluid from the intracellular compartment into the extracellular compartment. So your blood and what's called interstitial fluid is considered the extracellular compartment of fluid in the body. So it's not within cells. You carry most of your fluid in the body at any one time is inside your body's cells, but obviously it can shift. And so as we get dehydrated or as we lose fluid, some of the way that the body combats that is to shift fluid from the intracellular to the extracellular compartment to backfill what you're losing. But after a certain point, of course, we can't either do that fast enough or we can't do enough of it without causing problems at a cellular level. So we have to drink to replenish that blood volume. And so when people talk about getting really dehydrated and what the problem is for an exercising person, fundamentally it's that your blood volume drops and your blood gets thicker. So making sure that you maintain enough fluid intake in order to keep that blood volume high enough for the duration that you're going for is what good hydration boils down to.
So would you say the main mistake people are making when it comes to hydration is that they're allowing that blood volume to go down by not drinking enough? Or do you think people are on the other end of the scale drinking so much water that they're ending up in a state like we were in your racing where you're maybe diluting the electrolytes in your blood?
I think you can definitely get both. You can get it wrong on both accounts, and depending on which papers you read and which studies you look at, the marker that is actually generally more difficult than you'd think to assess someone's hydration status accurately. One of the best ways to do it is to weigh someone before they do something and weigh them afterwards, and assume that the body weight loss is fluid loss, because although we burn some substrate, we burn some glycogen, tiny amounts probably of fat and protein and stuff, we mainly lose fluid. So if you run for an hour, let's say, and you lose 1 kilo in body weight and you don't drink anything, the chances are that the vast majority of that is fluid loss. So you can be pretty sure you've sweated out a litre basically. And I think in what we see at the end of races, when you look at studies that look at the health and status and the hydration status of people at the end of races, is some people get quite dehydrated, and they're the people that have lost a lot of body weight and potentially are feeling very thirsty and are exhibiting the classic signs of dehydration. But on the other side, we get around something like 10 or 15%, depending again what studies you look at marathons, Ironmans. We see 10 or 15% of people who are adequately hydrated or overhydrated even, but whose blood sodium levels are very, very low. And that's a condition called hypernatremia. And that is often ascribed to having drunk too much fluid during an event, because when we sweat, we obviously lose fluid and sodium, or fluid and salt. When we just put water or just put very dilute sports drinks back in, there becomes a point at which our blood sodium level gets diluted and starts to drop. And this was the problem that I was suffering from more predominantly than dehydration. Was I knew I had a high sweat rate. I was therefore paranoid about underhydrating in hot climates, and would overdrink to the point where I diluted the sodium levels down in my blood. And that, so I would say it's a very hard question in terms of what's the most common, but I would say when you get your hydration wrong, it's usually one of those two extremes. It's we've not consumed enough, or we've overconsumed to the point of dilution. And clearly, good hydration is somewhere in the middle, and it's about meeting your body's needs within a range that's tolerable. And although as a company, we're called Precision Hydration. Our aim is to sort of help you be more precise with this. The kind of irony is that the level of precision required to get that right is not super high. It's avoiding the extreme pitfalls, because if you get it roughly right with your fluid and electrolyte intake during exercise, your body has massive compensatory mechanisms in the way it can move fluid around and sort of keep things in balance. So you only, if this was hitting a target, it's like hitting a barn door, not hitting a bullseye. We just need to get it about right. And we tend to find that it's when it it goes drastically wrong one way or the other, that we hit the biggest problems. The reason that exercising where you guys are in such a hot and humid environment presents such a challenge is obviously that the volume and rate of sweat loss can be extraordinarily high for everyone, not just even for people that have relatively high sweat. It's like, I'll sweat a lot in even moderate conditions, but everybody is going to sweat a lot in hot and humid conditions. So the sort of the magnitude of loss is so great that it widens the opportunity for errors to be made, because your net fluid and net sodium losses can be super high.
Interesting stuff. And I think like it's important to understand too, both of those can be quite dangerous as well, right? If you really go all in on dehydration, you can end up very sick. And recently, in maybe the last 5 years or so, I know of someone that died at the Singapore Marathon as a result of overhydrating. They essentially drowned themselves, I think. So it's a bit scary.
I would say for the average athlete, the chances of an acute problem in a race are, for a lot of people, is probably more tilted towards hyponatremia through overconsumption, because in races we tend to see people being more diligent about their hydration, people being more paranoid about getting enough in. Lots of races, especially in hot climates, have very frequent aid stations and opportunities to drink. So the chances of becoming dehydrated would mean you've probably got to deliberately abstain from drinking what's available. I think the problem with dehydration for you guys is more stepwise depletion and chronic dehydration over days and days. So as in, you do a hard training session one day and you're living in a hot and humid environment and you're not adequately hydrating afterwards. And what you get is a kind of, you start on Monday with a decent level of hydration, let's say, but then you train in hard Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you're just sweating a lot because of the environment, and you get to a point where you get this kind of stepwise depletion and chronic dehydration can kick in. So you're just basically starting each day a little bit more dehydrated, a little bit more on the back foot if you're not adequately topping up from during or after hard training sessions. And you haven't got, like in the UK, obviously we might sweat when we're training, but certainly for the most part of the year, you're not walking around like sweating heavily all the time. Whereas for you guys it is. So I would, it's a generalization, but I would probably say that dehydration is more of a day-to-day risk if you're not being really diligent about keeping up with your losses in training, and hyponatremia is more of an isolated risk of over consuming fluid either in big training sessions or races when you are focused on topping up.
Yeah, man, I think that's pretty spot on, and we see that all the time with people where it's so easy here, even though it's hot, to just be sitting around doing your work and just forgetting to put something in. We even see it at the track and at our sessions, right? Like our guys will run for 30 to 50 minutes and take in very little fluid, which it's not too bad. It's a little bit cooler in the evenings when we do it, but they'd certainly benefit afterwards from putting some liquid back in their system and starting that recovery process for future training sessions, right?
Definitely. That's another thing we talk to athletes a lot about, is that you may well be able to get through a training session pretty easily, 30, 40, 50 minutes, even an hour even, without drinking. But if you're going to do that and expect to train again the next day or sometime shortly after, the hydration that you take in during that session is more like advanced recovery hydration, rather than you don't need the hydration to get through that session in good shape. But especially if you're finishing it late in the evening, you haven't got time to adequately rehydrate afterwards, then you kind of want to do some of your drinking ahead of time. So I think sometimes if you're creating the opportunity to drink during training sessions or being a little bit more aggressive with your fluid and electrolyte intake than you otherwise would,
yeah,
can be helpful for that. It's like prepping for the next session.
Great advice. Great advice. All right, let's get into the questions from the guys, mate. RJ is asking, is there such a thing as overhydration? We've just touched on this a little bit. I once took a bottle of pH 1500 the night before and also the morning just before a race, and I felt sort of queasy after I finished drinking it 1 hour before the start of the race, though I did feel better after the race started and when I started sweating.
Yeah, so overhydration definitely there is, and you can do it numerous ways. You know, basically, I think the most common way I see athletes overhydrate is walking around with a massive water bottle in the days before an event and just chugging constantly. And there's this kind of attitude towards we've got to have when I go to the toilet, my pee has got to be clear, otherwise I'm not adequately hydrated. And the problem with that approach is that it often leads to excessive fluid intake. You know, because you are just basically overdoing the intake the whole time. Um, with that specific question though about, you know, because the what's described there is what we would usually recommend is like pH 1500 is very strong in terms of electrolytes, and so we recommend drinking a smaller quantity of that in the last 24 hours before an event to try to combat the fact that hyponatremia is an issue by getting some extra salts in. They go into the bloodstream, they pull fluid in there, expand your blood volume, but don't dilute it, or don't dilute it as much. And I think when you get feedback from your body like feeling a bit queasy or something like that, often in the days before an event, athletes will obviously taper down training, increase calorie intake, increase salt intake in food, things like that. And if you find that you're taking like a pre-race or pre-workout hydration drink, or anything for that matter, that's making you feel a bit like I've had enough, then that's the time to really listen to your body and say, well, we recommend, like off the bat, we would recommend about 500 milliliters, you know, about half a liter as being a reasonable preload dose. But if you drink 200 or 300 milliliters of that and feel like you've had enough, you know, you're feeling like fairly full or whatever, then it's totally fine to draw the line there. And there's a huge amount of like learning to read your body's signals when it comes to hydration and nutrition in general, actually. But with hydration, it's like there are probably, we put out guidelines and we try to make them as individual as possible, but the next level to that is like taking those guidelines and actually then changing them on a day-to-day basis. To give you an example, before a race, I'm obviously a big sweater, I lose a lot of salt. Before a race, I will make sure I drink a bottle of pH 1500 the night before to make sure I'm really going in, you know, well topped up. But even myself, before that race in the morning, I'll mix up probably actually a liter of it, but I will completely drink as much as I feel like I need to, which could be a few mouthfuls or it could be half the bottle or more. And it's really, I really sort of rely on that race morning on like going on experience and instinct, which you build up over time of how much you need to take in. I would very rarely advocate for someone to like just smash away and consume a predetermined, prefixed amount, no matter how it leaves them feeling, because I think that's not listening to your body, which is what we need to try and do.
Great advice, man. It's like that with everything. Like, because sports science has the word science in it, I think people think it's like DNA where everything's exact. And, you know, in this field, there's still a lot of room for interpretation and movement, right? And a lot of this stuff is all around self-experimentation. So that's brilliant advice. His second question is, what is a typical hydration plan you would suggest for a heavy sweater running a marathon or doing an Ironman?
I think so. Ironman and marathon would definitely be considerably different. If we tackle Ironman to start with, I would say, and this is the goal for anyone starting a long distance race, especially in the heat, is first and foremost to start as well hydrated as you can. And we've got a blog on our website, which I'm sure you've seen, Ben, which I can share with you to distribute to the group, you know, to have a read of, because it gives a bit of a protocol and a breakdown. But starting well hydrated is the aim. And really, you know, the summary of that is you don't drink excessively in the days building up, but maybe a small amount of extra fluid, an extra cup or two of water in the days, a little bit of extra salt on your food to help you retain that fluid. But in the last 24 hours, the generalized gold standard is about 500 milliliters of a strong hydration drink the night before, and the same with your breakfast the morning of, depending on the start time, and with all the caveats that I just covered in the last question, you know, like depending on how you feel that morning and how much you want to take on. That would be the same for an Ironman or a marathon, because we want to just get to the start line kind of optimally hydrated, topped up, not hyponatremic. You know, there are a paper came out last year that looked at ultra marathon runners at the start of the Spartathon in Greece, and already like 12% of the runners there were hyponatremic at the start. And the only reason the researchers could could put on that was that they'd just been smashing water in the days before because they knew it was going to be a long, hot race. So the first aim is like get to the start line properly topped up, but not having overdone it and not being too light on the fluids. Once you get into the event, if we say for an Ironman, I think one of the most important and underrated things to think about is if you are a big sweater and if it's going to be hot, then your best opportunity all day to hydrate is obviously on the bike. And therefore, we need to hydrate on the bike almost without, and this is not a call to sort of like over drink or drink as much as we can, but we need to sensibly maximize fluid intake on the bike, because there is no point in getting off that bike substantially behind in terms of your hydration status, because we know it's only going to go downhill on the marathon, because the marathon's going to be in the hottest part of the day, because you're normally starting at 5-6 a.m. so you're running the marathon at lunchtime. You can definitely drink significantly less when you're running than you are on the bike, partly because of availability of fluid, because you've not just got a bottle there the whole time, and partly just because of the fact that the running motion, unless you're going to walk through all the aid stations, then the running motion is not conducive to getting lots of fluid in. I would say, as a rule of thumb, again, I don't always like rules of thumb, but they can be useful. If you can drink, whatever you can drink per hour on the bike, I see a lot of people drinking probably half of that or less per hour on the run. So you know that you're going to hit a deficit at some point on the marathon. And really, in an Ironman, the idea is like get off the bike as full of energy and as full of as hydrated as you possibly can be, with the view that you're then going to try to like manage the descent through the marathon so that you get to the finish line before you fall off a cliff. And I think the way to do that is to start to, in training, especially in your hard training sessions, is to start to experiment with what's a reasonably maximal level of fluid intake that you can comfortably process and tolerate, that keeps you fairly neutral in body weight. So if you're going out on a really hard 4-hour training ride in prep for an Ironman, how much can you drink per hour sensibly without forcing it down, that gets you reasonably close to not a lot of body weight loss on the other end of it? Because although if you were just doing that bike ride, you could probably tolerate several percentage points of body weight loss and perform really, really well, we've got to be mindful that we're only getting to the start line of a marathon in an Ironman when we've done that. So it's like working that out, and to calibrate people's thinking on what I would say is like the range of fluid intake that we normally see. I would say for someone who's a very light sweater, who's not losing a lot of fluid in an Ironman, something in the region of like between 300 and 500 milliliters of fluid an hour is probably on the real low end of what we'd see people consume. And for the big sweaters, the people who are losing a lot, I would say we occasionally see people drinking just over a litre an hour on the bike, but it's unusual to see dramatically more than that. I wouldn't say it's like unheard of, but if you're already drinking close to a litre an hour or a little bit more, you've got to be careful, because you're getting into that territory of where you could be starting to expose yourself to a risk of hyponatremia, because that's a high level of fluid intake. So that zone, that sweet spot, is often between 500 and 1,000 milliliters an hour, depending on sweat rate, conditions, and so on. And then alongside that, the range of sodium intake is quite large and what seems to work for people. For any of you that have had a sweat test, you'll understand the numbers are involved a bit more. But when we measure sweat, we see anything from about 200 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat to just over 2,000. I sit right up on the high end of that, and I'm losing about 1,800 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. And I tended to find that in a long, hot Ironman race on the bike, I needed to take between 1,000 and 1,500 milligrams of sodium per hour, which is a very high amount. But I worked my way up to that with, like Ben said, with some like good old-fashioned trial and error, and sort of found that range tended to get me off the bike in good shape and then set me up for a good marathon. We sometimes see people who can get away with significantly less, but that's where it comes down to understanding your physiology. But, to reiterate, I think Ironman is all about maximizing your ability to get off the bike in good shape to set yourself up for a good run. And the only other comment around that is super relevant, but that often gets overlooked is pacing. And pacing is not obviously directly linked to nutrition and hydration, but it's very closely linked, because if you don't get your pacing right, if you go too hard too soon, not only are you going to burn more calories, you're going to sweat more, you can often absorb less because you're diverting blood flow away from your gut. If you can keep the pace very kind and aerobic, so riding within yourself in an Ironman early on especially, that allows you to absorb more, it allows you to prep for later on. So all of those things are kind of intertwined, and the goal in the Ironman is like, get off the bike in great shape to have a good run. And it's incredibly hard to do that, but that is where you see people have put out their best performances. Once you get on the run, I very much think that you're somewhere between like 5 and 7 or 8 hours into this event at that point. And at that point, it's a little bit more about being instinctive and listening to your body. In the early part of the marathon, I often like to see people taking their time through aid stations and making sure you get some fluid and calories in to how you feel, because it is hard to correct for a big deficit later on, but planning for how much you're going to take at that point starts to become very difficult to do, because every time you get there, and all the Ironman races I've done, I've felt completely different every time I've got off the bike. It's just a bit of a nightmare. So you want to be in a place where you're acting more instinctively. When it comes to running a marathon, what I would say is that in terms of like hydration challenges, marathon is not insignificant, but it's if you're in it, that's especially true if you're running in a hot environment. But also, I wouldn't over stress about hydration, in terms of if you start a marathon hydrated and you sort of consume enough fluid to the dictates of thirst, often on the way round, you ought to be in a kind of place where you'll probably finish dehydrated, which is okay, as long as it's not dehydrated to a catastrophic extent. And there is a bit of an individual experimentation, but it's rare that I would see marathon runners, successful marathon runners drinking more than 400 or 500 milliliters an hour, because we accept that if we start hydrated, it's almost like if it was the Ironman, we've started in good shape, and we're just going to go a bit more on instinct. Ultras is obviously different, because it's a bit more like an Ironman, you've got multiple hours, and so without then getting into the individual cases of like looking at someone's sweat rate, looking at their sodium loss, there might be some, and we've worked with a few marathon runners who are very much on the extreme end of it and who have really high fluid and salt losses, and we have to be a bit more aggressive with them in the early stages of a marathon to get some fluid and salt in. But generally, marathon is a little bit easier to manage, I would say.
Definitely. And I think too that it's an interesting point as well, because I think a lot of people assume that you have to do a 1-for-1, right? Like if you're losing a liter of sweat in an hour, for example, you have to replace a full liter, and that's not necessarily the case, right?
Definitely not. I think that most of the time, aiming for somewhere between sort of, depending on the length of the race, between 40 and 60, 70% of replacement is probably reasonable. Most of us will start a long distance endurance event significantly heavier than we are normally. So that's because we've taken on extra glycogen, extra salt, extra fluid in the days before. You might gain a kilo or two in the last 48 hours, which is totally fine, because that's your body storing stuff up, ready to burn it off and sweat it out on the day. And so it wouldn't surprise me if from everything I've read and seen and experienced personally, that most people can tolerate 2, 3, 4% body weight drop during a marathon or a long distance event, and actually perform better under those circumstances than maintaining weight.
Interesting. All right, man. Jaslyn is asking a question about the pH product. So I think it's quite a good one, actually. She's saying, what is the maximum amount of hours that pH can stay mixed in water?
That's, we get asked that one quite a lot. And it's hard to give a firm, sort of firm answer. But having experimented with it a lot, I would say it's at least a day or two for the packet mix, the ones with sugar in. It depends obviously on the temperature and quality of the water that you're using and the storage conditions. But I've often mixed it up, mixed stuff up the day before or a day and a bit before, left it in a bottle, come back to it. You know, if I'm going out on an early morning bike ride, I'll mix up my bottles the day before, you know, stick them on the bottle cages so I'm ready to go, and it's totally fine. Honestly, with that one, with the sugars in it, I would say it's a simple case of giving it the sort of like the sniff and taste test. Like, does this still smell and taste okay? Because if it does, it's probably fine. And I would imagine if it's refrigerated or whatever, it will last for several days. The tablets, the effervescent hydration tablets, probably last even longer because they've got no sugars and things in which are going to, you know, lead to bacterial growth and whatnot. So I'd be confident to use those after a couple of days. But again, I would just use the sniff and taste test on it. But it's definitely not something which you're going to mix up and consume within a day or anything like that. You've got a bit of leeway.
That's awesome, because I think a lot of people are doing what you said. They're mixing it up at night or wanting to mix it up at night, put it in the fridge overnight, and then take it out and they're training in the morning. And we're just concerned that maybe it's going to go off or go bad or something like that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I've got one here. There's always a bottle in the side pocket of my van, and just, you know, God knows how many days this sits here sometimes, and I'll still pick it up and drink out of it, and I'm still here. I've not had food poisoning from it yet. So.
And you're a fine specimen too. Look at you. Righto, man. A lot of questions are coming in around, like, can you overdo the salt?
Yeah. The short answer is absolutely. Like everything, you can overshoot and you can undershoot, and that window of tolerance, like with fluid, is relatively wide. What we want to avoid is, I hate the extremes. You know, I hate people that want to promote like complete abstinence from electrolyte intake, because although there are people advocating for that these days, it is not based on any great evidence. It's more of a cultish, you know, sort of thing. At the same time, with athletes, and I've been guilty of this with many things in the past, we see this huge tendency of, like, if one of these pills or tablets is good, 2 must be great, 3 will be phenomenal. So what I'm going to do is take 8, you know, just to be sure. And then you do get problems with ODing on any substance. And the problem that you get when you take too much salt is that in the short term, you can make yourself feel quite sick and queasy because you affect the balance in your stomach and your gut. It'll either lead to you being sick and feeling nauseous, or it will lead to you getting diarrhea if it's especially if it's a longer event, because your body just wants to get rid of the excess very quickly. I think the other sign that you've taken too much salt over a longer period of time in a race is that you just start to really crave the taste of plain water and you get really thirsty. Because one of the things that drives thirst, the principal thing, is the salt level in your blood. So as you dehydrate, you know, your blood volume drops, as we talked about earlier. So the electrolyte concentration rises, your body measures that, makes you thirsty. And you can artificially make that happen by putting too much salt in. So you put too much salt in, you start to feel very, very thirsty, but thirsty for plain water. And that's where listening to your taste buds comes in quite heavily, because, you know, if you can start to identify, I often say, especially to ultra runners and even long distance cyclists, if they've got bottles of pH on their bike or in their running pack, sometimes it's a good idea to have a bottle of water as well, because at some point the water is going to start to taste really good, and that's just your body helping you to rebalance itself, because maybe you are going a bit hard on the salts and electrolytes. You want to rebalance that with a bit of plain water. So I would say the deeper into an event you get, the more you listen to your body. And if you're getting the strong signs that you're getting aversion to salt, or it's just not tasting very good anymore, move to water, see how you get on with that, and then balance it. And, you know, that again, it is slightly sort of, it's difficult to coach to begin with, but that thing about listening to your body and listening and reading the signs is really important. And what I would say, the reason we advocate for people to have a plan with their hydration and fluid and salt intake is not to stick to that plan rigidly, but it's so that you can start to build up this database of experience of what is too much for you. So I mentioned a figure of like 1 to 1.5 grams of sodium, 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of sodium per hour on the bike in an Ironman. And what I was always very careful to do as I was working that out was I would record how many, you know, like keep a mental ledger of how many salt capsules, because I was taking salt tablets at the time to get that in with water. And I would keep a ledger of how many I'd had in the last hour, so that if you start to feel like, you know, your performance is deteriorating or you're feeling a bit off, you kind of know whether you're well north or well south or about right of what you thought you might want to take, because your remedial action, if you've taken less than you thought, is obviously probably to take more. But if you've already taken close to the upper amount of what you expected you might need to take, it's maybe not as sensible to just go chucking more in. So it's all about having an appreciation for what those levels might be, and then you know, tweaking them from there, as opposed to just like the time when we see athletes take too much or more is that you get deep into an event, you start to feel rubbish, and then the typical response is like more of everything. I'm going to just drink more, take more salt, eat more calories, and it's not always the answer. It's sometimes it is, because you've underconsumed, but sometimes it's the exact opposite of what you need to do. Sometimes you need to stop for a while, slow the pace down, and actually let your body recover and catch up and digest, and then go again. So yeah, I'd say overconsumption is a thing, and it's to be avoided. What the one caveat to all of that, I would say, is if you're in very hot and humid conditions and you're sweating a lot, it's relatively hard, unless you go ridiculous, it's relatively hard to overconsume. Or it's if you overshoot on the electrolytes a little bit, it's probably better than undershooting.
I was just going to say, like, in my experience here, using it myself and just having seen the athletes here, like, I've seen a lot of people use a lot of salt, and it seems pretty hard to OD on it, but maybe that's a climate thing.
I think it is, and also you got to remember that the human body's, if your kidneys are functioning healthily and you're in good shape, then it's acutely, it's pretty hard to OD on salt to a point where it's going to be detrimental. You know, especially if it's in a drink, you may take extra in, and then when you pee, you may pee some of it out, but your kidneys can filter out a lot of salt, especially in the short term. So it's not and that is not, I always am careful when I say things like that, because it then sounds like an invitation just to take loads and loads. It's not. You still want to get in the sweet spot if you can, but being paranoid about taking a little bit too much. If you're taking, let's say, you know, 1,000 milligrams an hour in a hot race when you're sweating a lot, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot depending on who you talk to, but it's not a lot for your body to process. Because if you if you go to McDonald's and eat a Big Mac meal, you know, you're going to eat a lot of sodium in that, and your body's just going to pee most of that out in the hours afterwards. So you have that capacity to deal with it, a little bit of excess.
For sure. Right. Sean saying, how long does it take for the sweat salts and the pH 1500 effervescent tablets to get into your body and be effective for hydration?
No firm answer on that, but I would say from the people I've talked to, the physiologists, the nutritionists, the doctors, the general consensus seems to be that the stuff that's dissolved into a fluid already will probably be absorbed marginally quicker. But you're talking about something in the range of 10 to 20 minutes for something that you've swallowed, ingested, to get into your, if we were to measure it, to be able to measure it in your bloodstream. So it's probably something in that sort of zone. So not instant, but not taking an age.
Great. All right. He's saying, if you cannot take in enough fluids, but can take in the required sodium per hour, will this cause a sodium water imbalance in the body? Is this a problem, or will it just cause me to pee more during a race?
Yeah, so that can often be the case, actually, because your sweat is more dilute than most people's sweat is going to be more dilute than the strongest drinks that are available. So our strongest drink is 1,500 milligrams per litre, and for a lot of people, the average sweat sodium composition is 900 milligrams per litre. So if you were to drink 1,500 milligrams when you're losing 900 per litre, you know, obviously you're taking in a bit more salt but a bit less fluid. And I think that's a good strategy for people whose sweat losses, total volume sweat losses, are very, very high, certainly earlier on, because keeping that extra salt coming in helps to keep the blood volume up, stops the dilution happening. But it goes back to that old thing that I keep saying, is like listening to your body. And if at some point when you're taking a slightly stronger solution, it starts to taste less good, or you start to feel that dry mouth, or like thirsty, or that just that craving. The strongest one for me is always like a craving to drink plain water. Then you should start to move at that point to sort of diluting it and titrating it down with extra water. So I don't think it's a problem to go slightly stronger in the heat if you've got a really high sweat rate, but then just be sort of sympathetic to your body later on, that you may need to correct. If you start to overshoot, you may want to correct with some extra plain water.
Very good advice.
Great
Now,
stuff.
Mandy's saying, how do I plan my hydration for training racing in cooler climates when I'm so used to training in the tropics? She can't seem to get it right.
It's a good question, because we normally get asked the exact opposite, because we obviously deal with a lot of people who train in the cool and then have to go and race in the heat. And I would say the way we answer it for people in the heat is often to try where we can to get them to simulate conditions, by training indoors and that sort of thing, to try to get a handle on what their sweat rates might be and whatnot. Honestly, it's quite tricky to do it as a pen and paper exercise. What I would say is that and this is stating the obvious, but whatever strategy works for you in those hot and humid conditions is obviously going to be the ceiling. We're definitely not going to want to go north of that. So we start to come down a little bit. And I would say that the range is quite large. So if I've seen people whose strategy for, say, a hot Ironman, using an actual example, a hot Ironman in Texas is quite aggressive on fluid and sodium intake. We've got guys taking 1 litre an hour of fluid and about 1,100 milligrams of sodium per hour. He's done Norseman triathlon in cold conditions and basically drunk like 300 millilitres an hour on the bike. So it can be significantly less, even for the same individual in colder conditions. So it's a case of, I would say, taking a sensible look at where you think how much cooler, how much more temperate it is, and then taking a percentage off what those figures are, and having like those kind of guardrails. So let's say if you're a litre an hour person in the extreme heat, but you're going somewhere where it's really quite cool and temperate, then maybe a good starting point is to back that off to 60 or 70% of what you would take in the heat, and use that as a starting point. But then it is going to require some testing and adjusting, because for instance, for me, I'm someone who sweats a lot, so I sweat a hell of a lot in the heat, but I even sweat a lot in temperate conditions, because if you're fit and well conditioned and working really, really hard, actually my capacity to sweat more when it's hot is there's only so much further it can go. I'm already probably sweating at 1.5 litres an hour in temperate conditions, so my sweat rate might increase to somewhere closer to 2 litres an hour if it's very, very hot, but it's not such a big difference. So without trying to be evasive, it's difficult to say, and it's going to take some trial and error. But with that particular question, what I would say, and I'll say this probably again at the end of this talk anyway, is that we're doing we're at PH with our sports science team and customer service team at the moment, the ability to book one-to-one Zoom calls with the team for free if you've got questions and stuff, and I can give Ben the link for that, and so we can put that out, and if anyone wants to follow up on some of these individual questions with myself or any of the team, we can book a call and really get into your specifics, because I'm talking relatively generally here today.
That'd be awesome, man. I'm pretty sure there'll be a high rate of take up on that. Last question, because I'm mindful of your time, mate. This is coming from Kanishk, and he's saying, trying to stick with all things natural, why is rock salt / black salt taken in optimal quantities, of course, not good enough to fulfill the body's electrolyte needs during exercise? Why do we need processed stuff?
The short answer is you don't need processed stuff. What you need is, when you're exercising, you need 3 things. You need water, you need to combat what you're losing in your sweat, you need calories in terms of what you're burning, and you need salts if you're sweating enough to lose them. And so getting those 3 things in roughly the right proportions is the be all and end all of a good nutrition plan. To an extent, it doesn't matter where those things come from. The reason that processed stuff is popular is because, well, there's probably two reasons when it comes to getting salts in. One is that salt is sodium, salt like rock salt, table salt, whatever, is sodium chloride, NaCl. And when we start to take relatively large amounts of salt in, it can be quite aggravating on the stomach. It's quite acidic, and you imagine putting a heavy dose of salt into your drink, actual table salt, and trying to drink it, it will taste pretty yucky, and you're not going to get a large volume of it down. It can make you feel quite sick. In processed sports nutrition products, quite often we use sodium carbonate, sodium citrate, forms of sodium that are less overtly salty and that deliver a reasonable or a high dose of sodium without aggravating the stomach, and so you can drink higher quantities. So if you look on the packets of pH 1500 or whatever, the primary delivery of sodium in there is sodium citrate, which is a little bit easier, because if you mixed up a drink with 1500 milligrams of sodium per litre using table salt, it would taste horrendously like seawater, and you just wouldn't be able to drink it. So I think that's where the dose you're getting. So if you're trying to work out like milligrams per hour and this and that, packaged and processed nutrition is useful, because it allows you to work that out really clearly. Having said that, I've run ultra marathons and done the Transalpine trail run in the Alps, which is multi-day, and although I took some packaged stuff there, they had fantastic aid stations, and a lot of the electrolyte intake that we got from those events was at the aid stations. They had salt where you could roll these little boiled potatoes in the salt and eat them and just get salts in like that. And fundamentally, as long as you're putting it in the body in roughly the right dosage, it doesn't matter where it comes from. You just got to make sure that if you're using natural products, you kind of understand how much you're actually getting.
And that's the biggest challenge, right? Hey, have you, on the sodium citrate front, have you ever drank sodium citrate straight?
I've not actually, no. Sorry, what was that?
No, my coach had me doing it for a while before a race, because it's a lactate buffer as well, right? And I used to have a bit of a hard time with the quick World Cup starts. And it worked really well. Like, it made my start significantly better, but I had such a hard time stomaching it. God, it tastes foul.
Yeah, you're right. That would have probably been a really high dose as well, in order to make it act as a lactate buffer, because you've got to take a large quantity of it.
Straight out of a
but
bottle.
The only time I've tried, because when we set out to make our drinks, first of all, we wanted to make one that almost didn't taste of anything if we could. That was the aim. And so we tried a lot of electrolyte mixes without any flavors in them. And what I found was that even the electrolytes alone tended to lead to, like you've described, like a pretty overpowering taste, especially if you made them stronger. So that's why we ended up settling on like a very mild citrusy type flavor, which seemed to do the best it can to mask the saltiness without being overpowering to drink, because we know that palatability of drinks is clearly massively important in enabling people to drink enough over hours and hours, especially in the heat. So yeah, I've never tried it on its own, but I tried those like raw drink mixes, and they were just never going to be a success.
Nasty, eh? No, you guys have done a brilliant job on the products, mate. When we started working with you, like I was, at least in the past, my experience with any nutrition products is there's always like, it's very hit and miss, because everyone's so unique. And I really thought we'd see a lot more negative feedback on your products than we have. Like, the overwhelming response to people using your products has been fantastic. And I think that's testament to the work you guys are doing and all the time you're putting into it. And I think one of your big assets as well is, having been such a high level athlete, you use it yourself, you know what you're looking for, and you're sort of scratching your own itch, which is always a good way to make a product, I think.
Yeah, you're right in one respect there, definitely, that we spent a lot of time, like especially on the flavor. We decided that it was really easy when we're doing flavors to start with to make a drink that tasted good if you mixed it with lovely, clean, filtered, chilled water in a lovely glass, and that you can make a lot of things taste really good then. So the ultimate test for us when we were narrowing the flavors down was we were mixing it up in a crappy old sports bottle and sitting in the heat chamber at the lab, having let it get up to room temperature and be horrid and warm, and then trying to drink it down when you were doing a really hard bike session. And if you could, and that was a really good way to like thin out the flavors, because some flavors that we thought tasted fantastic when we got them mixed up at rest, actually a lot of people couldn't stomach them during exercise. And like anything, taste preference is really, really individual, and there's definitely no such thing as like a universal flavor that everybody loves. But I think what we've hopefully got close to is something that a lot of people really like. A lot of people, the vast majority of people, can definitely tolerate at the very least drinking large quantities of it. And there's probably only a few people. We get genuinely very few like returns or complaints about flavor specifically. You know, it's really, you know, generally pretty well received.
Yeah, you guys have done a great job, man. Great job. Now, Andy, I'm mindful of your time, mate, and I can see the sun is up in the UK, and it's probably time to be getting back to your camping trip, mate. So we'll wrap it up with you. Before we go, is there anywhere you want to drive people? They should definitely check out your website, precisionhydration.com, and I'll link that. But is there anywhere where they can follow you personally, or is there anything else you want to recommend they check out?
I think the main one would be hitting the website, and the blog section on there has got lots of good articles on there. It's keyword searchable. We've just updated it, so have a poke around on there if you know. And I'll send you a couple of links, Ben. I'll send you the one to how to start hydrated. We've talked a bit about hyponatremia. We've talked about this kind of balancing of the intake of salt, fluid, calories, whatever. We've got a few blogs, so I'll quickly ping you those on email so that you can share those with the group. The other one would definitely be either email us. Our email is really easy. It's just hello@precisionhydration.com. That comes through into the team. I think our average response rate on emails at the moment is about 12 hours, you know, not including the weekends. So shoot us questions on there. And the other one that I will send you to share is this link to the Zoom, booking a Zoom call one-to-one with us. So if anyone wants to do that, it's a booking system. You just put in what time zone you're in. It figures out, overlays that with our availability. And then you can book a 20-minute call with one of the team, pose your questions in the booking system, and then gives us a chance to have a little research before we sit down and have a chat with you. And we've got slots open up from, you know, early next week, so we can do that. And yeah, it'd be great to connect. So if we've missed any questions today, or if anyone's got anything they want to follow up on, then just take it up with us, you know, one-to-one.
Mate, that's brilliant. And I'm pretty sure there'll be a high number of coached athletes reaching out to take advantage of that. Now, once again, man, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate you waking up so early to come and speak with us, especially while you are on a camping trip. So thanks very much, mate.
No worries.